My sister said I'd never find a man, so I introduced her to this person at my engagement party. When she saw who it was, her face went completely white. My mother dropped her champagne glass. My father couldn't speak. But let me tell you how we got there. It wasn't supposed to feel like revenge. When I sent out those engagement invitations, I thought I was just sharing good news. I thought maybe, for once, my family would be proud of me. I thought Sarah might actually smile when she opened that cream-colored envelope with the gold lettering. I thought she might call me and squeal the way sisters are supposed to when their siblings find love. I was wrong about everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The comment came on a Tuesday 3 weeks before the party. I was at Sarah's apartment, sitting on her pristine white couch that nobody was allowed to eat on, watching her fold laundry with the precision of someone who'd turned domestic tasks into performance art. She had this way of making even the mundane look effortless, like she was born knowing how to make hospital corners and arrange throw pillows. I was telling her about David, about how he'd proposed during our weekend trip to the mountains, how he'd hidden the ring in my hiking boot because he knew I'd never look there, how we'd laughed until we cried when I couldn't figure out why my foot felt weird for the first mile of our trail, how he'd gotten down on one knee right there on the rocky path, dirt under his fingernails, hair messy from the wind, telling me I was his adventure. Sarah kept folding, smooth mechanical movements. She didn't look up when I showed her the ring, didn't ask about the proposal, didn't even pause in her rhythm. When I finished talking, she held up a perfectly creased sweater and said it. "You know he's not going to stick around, right?" I blinked. "What?" She set the sweater down and finally looked at me. Her expression was patient, almost kind, the way you'd look at a child who insisted monsters were real. "Lisa, come on. You're 26. You've never had a relationship last more than 6 months. You live in that tiny studio apartment with the leaky faucet. You work at a bookstore." Each word hit like a small stone. So men like David don't marry women like you." She picked up another sweater, shook it out. "He's a doctor, Lisa. He drives a BMW. He probably makes more in a month than you make in a year. He loves me." Sarah's laugh was soft, almost sympathetic. "I'm sure he thinks he does. But when reality hits, when he realizes what his friends will think, when he sees how different your worlds are," she shrugged, "he'll find someone more suitable." I felt something cold settle in my chest. "Someone like who?" "Someone like me." She said it matter-of-factly, the way she might comment on the weather. "Someone who fits. Someone who went to the right schools, knows the right people, can host dinner parties and speak French and won't embarrass him at hospital galas." The silence stretched between us. Outside I could hear kids playing in the courtyard, their voices bright and careless. Inside the air felt thick. "I didn't mean to hurt your feelings," Sarah added, her tone gentler now. "I just don't want you to get your hopes up. It's better to be realistic." I left without saying goodbye, walked home in a daze, my engagement ring feeling suddenly heavy on my finger. I kept replaying her words, the casual way she'd dismantled my happiness. "Someone like me. Someone like you." As if I was a species she'd studied and found lacking. That night, David found me sitting on my fire escape, staring at the city lights. He climbed out the window and settled beside me, his shoulder warm against mine. "You're quiet tonight," he said. I told him about Sarah, about what she'd said. I watched his face, waiting for something to flicker there, some sign that maybe she was right, that he'd been having second thoughts. Instead, he took my hand. "Your sister sounds like she's never been loved the way I love you." "She's beautiful," I said. "Successful. She has a corner office, and a 401k and knows how to make soufflé. And I work retail and live in a shoebox, and can barely make mac and cheese without burning it." David was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You know what I thought the first time I saw you?" I shook my head. "I thought there's someone who's actually alive." He squeezed my hand. "You were laughing at something your coworker said. And it wasn't polite laughter or careful laughter. It was this huge, ridiculous, snorting laugh that made everyone else in the coffee shop smile. And I thought, I want to be the person who makes her laugh like that." My throat felt tight. "Sarah says you'll get tired of me." Sarah doesn't know me. His voice was firm. And she doesn't know us. But the seed was planted. Over the next few weeks, as we planned our engagement party, I found myself watching David differently, looking for signs of doubt, moments of hesitation. When he corrected my pronunciation of hors d'oeuvres, was that annoyance? When he suggested we serve wine instead of beer, was that embarrassment? When his medical school friends talked about their residencies, and I had nothing to contribute, did he notice how quiet I got? I started second-guessing everything. My outfit choices, my conversation topics, the way I held my fork. I caught myself practicing small talk in the mirror, trying to sound more sophisticated, more worthy. It was exhausting. Meanwhile, Sarah seemed to be everywhere. She'd call with helpful suggestions about the party. Had I considered hiring a real caterer instead of making the food myself? Was I sure about having it at my apartment when David's parents were coming? Wouldn't a restaurant be more appropriate? I'm just trying to help, she'd say when I got defensive. I want this to go well for you. But underneath her concern, I heard something else. A smugness, like she was watching a slow-motion car crash and taking notes. The worst part was how everyone else seemed to agree with her. My mother called to ask if I was sure about the timing. My father wondered if David had met any of our people yet, as if our family needed to be interviewed for worthiness. My cousin Emma sent her regrets with a note that felt more like condolences than congratulations. Even Mrs. Henderson, my elderly neighbor who usually had nothing but kind words for everyone, stopped me in the hallway to say, "That's quite a catch you've got there, dear. I hope you know how lucky you are." Lucky. As if David was a lottery ticket I'd stumbled across, not someone who'd chosen me deliberately, who'd seen something in me worth loving. The engagement party was set for a Saturday in October. I'd spent weeks planning every detail, determined to prove that I could host something elegant, something worthy of David and his world. I'd borrowed my grandmother's china, bought flowers from the farmer's market, spent hours practicing recipes I'd found online. My tiny studio apartment had been transformed into something that almost looked sophisticated. Sarah arrived early, ostensibly to help, but really to inspect. She walked through my apartment with the air of a building inspector, noting every imperfection. The carpet was a little worn, the lighting was dim, the kitchen was cramped. She didn't say any of this directly, just made small comments that added up to a symphony of inadequacy. "Oh, you're using paper napkins," she observed, fingering the ivory cocktail napkins I'd thought were elegant. "Cloth seemed impractical for the size of the space," I said. "Meh." She moved on to the appetizers. "These look homemade." "They are homemade." "How authentic." The word dripped with something that wasn't quite mockery but wasn't approval either. David arrived with his parents, Dr. and Mrs. Harrison, who were exactly as intimidating as I'd expected. His mother was tall and silver-haired, with the kind of understated elegance that comes from never having to think about money. His father had David's eyes, but none of his warmth, surveying my apartment like he was calculating property values. "What a cozy space," Mrs. Harrison said, which somehow sounded more condescending than if she'd just called it small. "Lisa's very creative with what she has," David said, his hand finding mine. I loved him for trying, but I could hear how the words landed. "What she has," as if my limitations were charming in their modesty. The party filled up quickly. David's colleagues mixed with my friends from the bookstore. My family scattered throughout. I watched the groups form and reform, noting how they naturally segregated. The doctors talked about medical journals and conference calls. My friends discussed book recommendations and weekend plans. The two worlds orbited each other politely, but never quite merged. I was in the kitchen, refilling the wine glasses, when I heard Sarah's voice rising above the conversation. She was talking to Mrs. Harrison, their heads bent together conspiratorially. "She's always been the dreamy one," Sarah was saying. "Head in the clouds, you know. I used to worry she'd never find someone practical enough to ground her." "How thoughtful of you to look out for her," Mrs. Harrison replied. "Well, that's what big sisters are for. I just want her to be happy, even if she doesn't always make the most realistic choices." I set down the wine bottle harder than I meant to. The sound made both women look up, and Sarah's smile was saccharine when she saw me. "There she is. We were just talking about how wonderful it is that you found David." "Wonderful," I repeated. He's such a stabilizing influence, Mrs. Harrison added. Lisa's lucky to have someone so grounded. That word again, lucky. As if my engagement was a fluke, a cosmic accident that could be corrected with enough scrutiny. I excused myself and went to the bathroom, needing a moment to breathe. When I looked in the mirror, I saw what they saw. A girl playing dress-up in her grandmother's pearls, trying to be something she wasn't. My lipstick was smudged, my hair was starting to escape its careful styling, and there was a wine stain on my dress that I hadn't noticed before. I fixed what I could, and went back out to find David deep in conversation with Sarah. She was animated, gesturing with her wine glass, and he was laughing at something she'd said, really laughing the way he laughed with me when we were alone. And then I told the client, "Sir, the law doesn't care about your feelings," Sarah was saying. "But you know how it is. Everyone thinks they're special." God, yes, David agreed. You should see some of the patients I get. They Google their symptoms and suddenly they're medical experts. They were bonding over shared frustration with difficult people, and I felt like an outsider looking in. Sarah worked in corporate law, dealt with high-stakes negotiations and million-dollar contracts. She spoke David's language in a way I never could. "Lisa, come here," David called, reaching for my hand. "Sarah was just telling me about this case she's working on. You should hear this." I joined them, but the conversation had moved beyond me. They talked about professional hierarchies, and client management, and the politics of partnership tracks. I smiled and nodded, contributing nothing, feeling smaller with each exchange. "You're so quiet tonight," Sarah observed, her concern sounding genuine to anyone who didn't know her. "Are you feeling all right?" "Just tired," I said. "Planning a party is exhausting," she agreed. "I remember when I threw that fundraiser for the Children's Hospital last year. 200 guests, full catering, live music. I was dead on my feet by the end." The comparison hung in the air. Her fundraiser with 200 guests versus my intimate gathering of 30. Her professional catering versus my homemade appetizers. Her charitable cause versus my personal celebration. David's arm tightened around my waist. "Lisa did an amazing job with everything," he said firmly. "This is exactly what we wanted." But I caught the slight emphasis on we, and I wondered if it was true. If this cramped, imperfect party was really what he'd wanted, or if he was just being kind. The evening continued, and I found myself watching from the edges. My friends from the bookstore seemed overwhelmed by the doctors and lawyers, clustering together near the kitchen. David's colleagues were polite but distant, the kind of polite that feels like a wall.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. And Sarah moved between the groups effortlessly, charming everyone, making the connections I couldn't make. She told Mrs. Harrison about her volunteer work with literacy programs. She discussed investment strategies with Dr. Harrison. She found common ground with David's colleague who'd done his residency in Boston, where she'd gone to law school. She was everything I wasn't: poised, accomplished, appropriate. "Your sister is delightful," Mrs. Harrison told me during a quiet moment. "So accomplished, you must be very proud." "I am," I said, "because what else could I say?" "It's wonderful when siblings complement each other so well," she continued. "Sarah with her career and social connections, and you with your creativity." Creativity, the consolation prize for people who couldn't manage anything more substantial. By the time the last guest left, I was drained. David helped me clean up, stacking plates and wrapping leftover food, but I could feel his exhaustion too. We worked in relative silence, the apartment looking shabby and small now that it was empty. "That went well," he said finally, though something in his tone suggested he was trying to convince himself as much as me. "Did it?" He stopped washing dishes and looked at me. "What do you mean?" "I mean, did it really go well? Or are you just being nice?" David set down the sponge. "Lisa, what's wrong?" "Everything I wanted to say. Everything is wrong. I don't fit in your world, and tonight proved it. Your mother thinks I'm a charity case. Your colleagues see me as the girlfriend who'll get upgraded eventually. My own sister thinks you're too good for me, and maybe she's right. But I couldn't say any of that without sounding pathetic, so I said, 'Nothing. I'm just tired.'" He dried his hands and pulled me into his arms. "Hey, tonight was perfect. You were perfect."
I leaned into him, wanting to believe it. But over his shoulder, I could see Sarah's wine glass on the coffee table, lipstick stain on the rim, like a signature. A reminder that she'd been here, charming everyone, showing me exactly what I wasn't. That night, after David fell asleep, I lay awake replaying every conversation, every look, every moment of awkwardness. I thought about the way Mrs. Harrison had said cozy, like it was a polite word for inadequate. The way David's colleagues had talked around me rather than to me. The way Sarah had effortlessly commanded attention while I faded into the background of my own party. Maybe she was right. Maybe this whole thing was temporary, a phase David would grow out of once he realized what he could have instead. Someone like Sarah, who could host fundraisers and speak the language of his world and never embarrass him at hospital galas. I turned onto my side and watched him sleep, memorizing the curve of his shoulder, the way his hair fell across his forehead. In the morning I'd go back to pretending everything was fine. But tonight, in the darkness of my small apartment, I let myself imagine what it would feel like when he finally figured out what everyone else already knew. That I wasn't enough. The next few weeks passed in a strange haze. David seemed unchanged, still bringing me coffee in the mornings, still texting me silly jokes during his lunch breaks, still looking at me like I was something precious. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was living on borrowed time. Sarah, meanwhile, had opinions about everything. The wedding venue I'd chosen was charming but perhaps too small. The photographer was affordable, but did I know about this other person who'd shot society weddings? The dress I'd picked out was sweet, but maybe I should consider something more classic. Each suggestion felt like a paper cut, small but accumulating into something that stung. "I'm just trying to help," she'd say whenever I got defensive. "I want your wedding to be everything you've dreamed of." But her version of my dreams looked suspiciously like her own preferences. Elevated and expensive and nothing like what I actually wanted. The breaking point came 3 weeks later, at my cousin Rachel's birthday party. It was a casual backyard barbecue, the kind of family gathering where everyone brought a dish and the kids ran around with sticky fingers while the adults nursed beers and caught up on gossip. I was looking forward to it. David had never met my extended family, and I thought maybe here, in this relaxed setting, he'd see a different side of us. The side that was warm and welcoming, rather than judgmental and competitive. We arrived with a tray of brownies I'd made the night before, and I immediately felt better. This was my element. Lawn chairs and paper plates, and my Uncle Mike telling the same stories he'd been telling for 20 years. David fit in instantly, helping my cousin set up the volleyball net, talking baseball with my dad, letting my nephew show him his collection of bottle caps. "He's wonderful," my Aunt Linda whispered to me, as we watched David patiently explain the rules of horseshoes to a group of kids. "You can tell he really cares about you." I smiled, feeling some of the tension I'd been carrying start to dissolve. Maybe Sarah was wrong. Maybe David didn't need someone who could discuss market fluctuations and wine pairings. Maybe he just needed someone who loved him. Then Sarah arrived. She swept into the backyard like she was making an entrance at a gala, perfectly dressed in designer jeans and a silk blouse that probably cost more than my monthly rent. She had her hair blown out, and her makeup flawless, looking like she'd stepped out of a magazine, while the rest of us looked like we'd stepped out of our houses on a Saturday afternoon. "Sorry I'm late," she announced, kissing Rachel on both cheeks in a gesture that seemed overly formal for a backyard barbecue. "Client crisis. You know how it is." She surveyed the scene with barely concealed disdain, taking in the folding chairs and the coolers full of beer and the paper tablecloth fluttering in the breeze. Then her eyes found David, and her expression shifted into something I'd seen before, but never directed at him. Interest. She made her way over to us, and I watched David's face light up in recognition. "Sarah, I didn't know you were coming. Wouldn't miss it," she said, giving him a hug that lasted a beat too long. "How are you holding up with all this wedding planning?" "Lisa's been running herself ragged. She's been amazing," David said. "I don't know how she manages everything." "Oh, she's always been the organized one." Sarah lied smoothly. Even as kids, she was the one keeping track of everyone's schedules. I stared at her. Sarah had always been the organized one. I'd been the messy one, the one who lost homework and forgot appointments and had to be reminded to brush my teeth. But David nodded like this made perfect sense, and Sarah continued weaving her revisionist history of our childhood. According to her, I'd been the responsible sister while she'd been the dreamer. I'd been the practical one while she'd been scattered and artistic. She flipped our entire dynamic, painting herself as the flighty one who'd needed my grounding influence. I don't know what I would have done without her. Sarah said, touching David's arm. She kept me focused when I wanted to drop out of law school. She's the reason I stuck with it. This was complete fiction. Sarah had been the star student, the one who'd graduated summa cum laude, while I'd struggled through community college. She'd never doubted her path for a second, certainly never needed my encouragement to stay in school. But David was eating it up, looking at me with new admiration. You never told me you helped Sarah through law school. I started, but Sarah jumped in. She's too modest. Always has been. She'll never tell you about all the times she talked me through my anxiety attacks, helped me study for the bar exam, convinced me I was smart enough to make partner. Each lie built on the last, creating an alternate reality where I was the confident, successful sister and Sarah was the one who'd needed saving. It was masterful, really. She was rewriting our story in a way that made me look good, while simultaneously positioning herself as vulnerable, grateful, indebted to my wisdom and support. David was completely charmed. For the rest of the party, he kept bringing up things Sarah had said, asking me about law school advice I'd never given and encouraging words I'd never spoken. I tried to correct the record, but every time I started to protest, Sarah would jump in with another detail, another story, that cast me as the hero and herself as the beneficiary of my guidance. Remember when I was so nervous about that first big case? She said at one point. You told me, Sarah, you've prepared for this your whole life. Trust yourself. I've carried those words with me ever since. I had never said anything like that. I'd barely known she had a big case, let alone offered advice about it. But David squeezed my hand, like he was proud of me, and Sarah's eyes sparkled with something that looked like gratitude, but felt like manipulation. By the end of the evening, David was looking at me differently. Like I was deeper than he'd realized, wiser, more accomplished. Sarah's lies had elevated me in his eyes, but they'd also created an impossible standard. How could I live up to the version of myself she'd invented? On the drive home, David couldn't stop talking about it. I can't believe you never told me about helping Sarah through law school, he said. That's incredible, Lisa. You really shaped her entire career. David, I don't think. And the way she talks about you, it's like you're her hero. I always thought she was a little dismissive of you, but clearly I was wrong. She obviously looks up to you so much. I stared out the window at the passing street lights, feeling trapped. If I told him the truth now, I'd sound petty and jealous. If I let the lies stand, I'd be living up to expectations I could never meet. You're amazing, David continued, reaching over to squeeze my hand. I'm so lucky to be with someone who's had such an impact on the people around her. Lucky, there was that word again. That night, I called Sarah. What the hell was that? I asked as soon as she picked up. What was what? At Rachel's party, all those stories about me helping you through law school. None of that happened. There was a pause, then Sarah's voice, carefully innocent. I don't know what you mean. You know exactly what I mean. You made up a whole history where I was your mentor or something. Why would you do that? Lisa, I think you're confused. I was just sharing some memories. They weren't memories. They were lies. Another pause. When Sarah spoke again, her tone was gentler, almost pitying. Maybe you don't remember. It was a long time ago, and you were dealing with a lot of your own stuff back then. The gaslighting was so smooth, so practiced, that for a moment I doubted myself. Had I helped her and forgotten? Was my memory that unreliable? Then I remembered who I was dealing with. Stop, I said. Just stop. I know what you're doing. I'm not doing anything. I'm trying to help you see how much you've accomplished, how much you've meant to people. David was so impressed. That's the point, isn't it? You want him to be impressed. You want him to see me as something I'm not. I want him to see you the way you deserve to be seen. No, I said, the pieces clicking into place. You want him to fall in love with a version of me that doesn't exist, so that when he realizes I'm not actually that person, he'll be disappointed. And maybe he'll start looking around for someone who actually is accomplished and confident and successful. Silence. Someone like you, I continued. Lisa, that's paranoid, is it? Because from where I'm sitting it looks like you're setting me up to fail. Building me up so you can watch me fall. You're my sister Sarah, said, and for the first time she sounded genuinely hurt. I would never do that to you, but I didn't believe her, not anymore. I hung up and sat in my dark apartment, David's breathing steady beside me, and tried to figure out what came next. Because Sarah was right about one thing, David was impressed with the woman she'd described. The woman who could guide someone through law school, who could offer wisdom and confidence and support. The woman I had never been, and would never be, and somewhere in the back of my mind, a plan began to form, because if Sarah wanted to play games with my life, if she wanted to manipulate and gaslight, and set me up for failure, then maybe it was time she learned that I wasn't as helpless as she thought. Maybe it was time she met the real me, the woman who was done being underestimated. The invitation arrived on a Thursday morning, cream-colored paper with elegant gold script that made my stomach drop before I even read the words. Sarah Martinez and Jonathan Blackwell request your presence at their engagement celebration. The date was circled in my mind before I'd finished processing the sentence. 2 weeks before my wedding, I stared at the invitation for a full minute, reading it over and over as if the words might rearrange themselves into something that made sense. Sarah was engaged. Sarah, who had spent months telling me that David would leave me, that men like him didn't stay with women like me, that I should be realistic about my prospects. Sarah was getting married. David found me sitting at the kitchen table, still holding the invitation like it might bite me. "What's that?" he asked, setting down his coffee and peering over my shoulder. "Sarah's getting married." His eyebrows shot up. I didn't even know she was seeing anyone seriously. Neither did I. In all our conversations about my relationship, all her warnings about David's inevitable departure, she'd never once mentioned having a boyfriend, let alone being close to engagement. I thought back to recent family gatherings, phone calls, casual conversations. Had she said anything about dating? About someone special? "Who's the guy?" David asked, settling into the chair across from me. I read the name again. Jonathan Blackwell. It didn't ring a bell.
Blackwell, David repeated slowly. Then his face changed, recognition dawning. Wait, Jonathan Blackwell? The surgeon? You know him? Of him. He's the head of cardiothoracic surgery at Presbyterian. He's like a legend in the medical community. Does these incredibly complex procedures that most surgeons won't even attempt. David's voice carried a note of awe that made my chest tighten. He's been featured in medical journals, speaks at conferences around the world. The guy is brilliant. Of course he was. Of course Sarah hadn't just found someone to marry. She'd found someone extraordinary, someone who made David, who I'd thought was pretty accomplished himself, sound starstruck. He's also about 15 years older than her, David added, which should have made me feel better but somehow didn't. I called my mother. "Oh honey, isn't it wonderful?" She gushed before I could even finish asking about the engagement. "We're so thrilled for Sarah. Jonathan is such a catch. When did they meet?" "About 6 months ago, at some charity function." He swept her off her feet. "Apparently, they've been practically inseparable ever since." 6 months. Sarah had been in a serious relationship for 6 months and hadn't mentioned it once. Not during my engagement party, not during any of our conversations about David, not during Rachel's barbecue when she was spinning elaborate lies about our childhood. Why didn't she tell anyone? "Oh, you know Sarah, she likes to keep things private until she's sure, and with someone like Jonathan, I think she wanted to make sure it was real before she got our hopes up." Our hopes up, as if Sarah's romantic life was a family investment. "The wedding will be at the country club, of course," Mom continued. 300 guests. They're flying in a chef from New York, and Sarah's already talking to florists about importing flowers from Ecuador. It's going to be absolutely magical. 300 guests. Imported flowers. A chef from New York. I thought about my own wedding, planned for David's parents' backyard, with catering from a local restaurant and flowers from the farmer's market.
Suddenly it all seemed very small. That's nice, I managed. I hope you and David can make it. I know it's close to your own wedding, but family is family. 2 weeks before my wedding, Sarah was getting married 2 weeks before me, which meant all the family energy, all the excitement and attention and congratulations would be focused on her first. By the time my wedding rolled around, it would feel like an afterthought. I hung up and stared at the invitation again. The paper was heavy, expensive, the kind of invitation that probably cost more per piece than my entire wedding stationery budget. Even in announcing her engagement, Sarah was outclassing me. That evening, I found myself doing something I'd never done before. I Googled Jonathan Blackwell. The results were overwhelming, page after page of articles, awards, speaking engagements. Photos of him at medical conferences, at charity galas, at hospital groundbreaking ceremonies. He was distinguished looking in that silver-haired, sharp-featured way that spoke of intelligence and success. In every photo, he looked like someone who belonged in boardrooms and operating theaters and exclusive social clubs. I clicked on images and found what I was looking for without really knowing I'd been looking for it. Photos from recent charity events, and there she was. Sarah, radiant in designer gowns, standing beside Jonathan like she'd been born to that world. In one photo, they were at a hospital fundraiser, Sarah presenting a check to the children's cancer ward. In another, they were at a medical conference in Switzerland, Sarah elegant in a black cocktail dress, at what appeared to be a formal dinner. She looked perfect, not just beautiful, which she'd always been, but perfect for him. Like she'd been designed to be a surgeon's wife, to host dinner parties and chair charity committees, and speak intelligently about medical research funding. I thought about David, about his admiration when he'd recognized Jonathan's name, about how my own accomplishments suddenly seemed laughable in comparison to Sarah's new status, working at a bookstore versus being engaged to one of the most respected surgeons in the city, living in a studio apartment versus whatever kind of life Jonathan could provide. The rational part of my brain knew I was being ridiculous. David loved me, not because of what I did, or how much money I made, or whether I could discuss cardiac procedures over dinner. He loved me because of who I was, how I made him laugh, the way I saw the world. But the other part of my brain, the part that had been listening to Sarah's warnings for months, whispered that maybe she'd been testing the waters. Maybe she'd been warning me about men like David leaving women like me, because she'd been planning to prove her point. I closed the laptop and tried to push the thoughts away, but they lingered like smoke. The engagement party was everything I'd expected, and worse, held at an exclusive hotel downtown, with valets and champagne service, and more flowers than I'd seen outside of a botanical garden. The guest list read like a who's who of the city's medical and legal elite, exactly the kind of people Sarah had always claimed to know. I'd agonized over what to wear, finally settling on a navy dress that David said looked beautiful, but that I knew was completely outshined by every other woman there. Sarah, of course, looked stunning in a champagne-colored gown that probably cost more than my monthly salary. Jonathan was exactly what I'd expected from the photos, but somehow more intimidating in person. Tall, silver-haired, with the kind of presence that drew attention without trying. When Sarah introduced us, his handshake was firm, his smile polite but distant. "Sarah's told me so much about you," he said, which made me wonder what exactly she'd shared. "Congratulations," I managed. "Sarah seems very happy." "We both are." His attention was already shifting away, scanning the room for someone more interesting to talk to. David, meanwhile, was practically vibrating with excitement. He kept bringing up Jonathan's recent publications, surgical techniques he'd pioneered, conferences where he'd spoken. It was clear he saw this as an opportunity to network, to connect with someone he genuinely admired professionally. "I've read your work on minimally invasive valve replacement," David told Jonathan when we found ourselves in the same conversation circle. "The outcomes you've achieved are incredible." Jonathan's face lit up in a way it hadn't when meeting me. "Thank you. It's been a passion project of mine for years. Are you in cardiology, emergency medicine? But I'm considering a fellowship in trauma surgery." They launched into a discussion about surgical techniques and patient outcomes that left me standing there like a decoration. Sarah, I noticed, participated effortlessly, asking intelligent questions about procedure success rates and patient recovery times. She spoke the language of medicine like she'd been studying it for years. "How do you know so much about cardiac surgery?" David asked her at one point. "Jonathan's been teaching me," she said, smiling at her fiancé. "I find it fascinating. The precision required, the life and death decisions. It's like the law, really, but with immediate consequences." Jonathan beamed at her like she'd said something profound. "Sarah has an incredible mind for detail. She grasps complex concepts faster than some of my residents." I watched them together, the way Jonathan's eyes followed Sarah when she spoke, the way she seemed to glow under his attention. They looked like they belonged together, like they'd been designed as a matched set. The brilliant surgeon and the accomplished lawyer, both beautiful, both successful, both inhabiting a world I could barely imagine accessing. "Your sister is remarkable," Jonathan said to me later, when David had been pulled away by another doctor who wanted to discuss residency programs. "She has this rare combination of intelligence and compassion. When she told me about helping you navigate your relationship challenges, I was so impressed by her wisdom." "My relationship challenges?" I stared at him, trying to process what he'd just said. "Sarah has such insight into human nature," he continued. "She's been invaluable in helping me understand the emotional aspects of patient care. Doctors sometimes focus too much on the medical side and forget about the human element." "What exactly did she tell you about my relationship?" I asked, my voice carefully neutral. "Just about how she's guided you through some difficult decisions. The way she described it, you were struggling with self-doubt about your engagement, worried that you weren't worthy of your fiancé. She's been such a supportive sister, helping you build confidence." The room felt like it was tilting. Sarah had told Jonathan that I was struggling with self-doubt about David, that I didn't think I was worthy of him. She'd positioned herself as my emotional support system, the wise older sister helping me through my insecurities, but she was the one who'd planted those insecurities in the first place. "She's always been there for me," I said, because what else could I say? "That's what family is for," Jonathan agreed. "Sarah lights up when she talks about you. She's so proud of how far you've come. How far I'd come. Like I'd been some kind of charity case that Sarah had taken on as a project." I excused myself and headed for the bathroom, needing air, needing space to think. In the hallway, I nearly collided with David, who was heading in the same direction. "Can you believe this place?" he said, gesturing at the marble floors and crystal chandeliers. "And Jonathan is even more impressive in person. The stories he was telling about his work in pediatric cardiac surgery. Did you know Sarah told him I was having doubts about our engagement?" David stopped walking. "What?" "She told him I was struggling with self-doubt, that I didn't think I was worthy of you. That she's been helping me through it." His face went through several expressions before settling on confusion. "Why would she say that?" "Because that's what she does. She creates problems and then positions herself as the solution." "Lisa, that doesn't make sense. Sarah's been nothing but supportive, has she? Has she really?" The words came out sharper than I'd intended. "Think about it, David. Every interaction you've had with her, she's either been undermining me or building herself up, or both. She helped you through law school." "No, she didn't. That was a lie, all of it." I took a breath, trying to calm down. "She's been manipulating both of us from the beginning." David looked genuinely confused, like I was speaking a language he didn't understand. "Lisa, I think you might be overthinking this. Sarah clearly cares about you. Maybe she's just concerned." "She's not concerned, she's calculating." But I could see in his eyes that he didn't believe me. How could he? Sarah had been so careful, so subtle in her manipulations. To him she was the accomplished lawyer, who'd helped her sister through law school, who'd guided me through relationship doubts, who'd been nothing but gracious and supportive. The idea that she was systematically undermining me probably sounded paranoid. We went back to the party, but the rest of the evening felt surreal. I watched Sarah work the room, charming everyone, collecting admiration like jewelry. I watched Jonathan introduce her to colleagues and donors, his pride obvious. I watched David continue to be impressed by their success, their sophistication, their easy command of social situations. and I felt myself shrinking, becoming smaller and more invisible with each passing hour. The worst moment came near the end of the evening, when Sarah stepped up to the microphone to give a toast. She looked radiant under the lights, confident and poised in a way I'd never been. "Thank you all for being here tonight," she began, her voice carrying easily across the room. "Jonathan and I are overwhelmed by your love and support." She talked about finding her soulmate, about the importance of partnership, about building a life with someone who challenged and inspired her. Everything she said was perfect, articulate, exactly what people wanted to hear. Then she found me in the crowd. "I also want to thank my family for their support, especially my sister Lisa. Lisa has taught me so much about courage and following your heart, even when others doubt you." Her smile was warm, seemingly genuine. "She's shown me that love isn't about finding someone perfect, it's about finding someone perfect for you." The room erupted in applause, and people turned to smile at me, this wise younger sister who'd apparently taught Sarah about love. But I heard the subtext, the careful phrasing that sounded supportive while actually being condescending. Love isn't about finding someone perfect, even when others doubt you. Each phrase reinforced the narrative, that my relationship was somehow lesser, more doubtful, requiring more courage to pursue. After the party, David and I drove home in relative silence. He seemed lost in thought, probably replaying conversations with Jonathan, thinking about surgical techniques and career opportunities. I stared out the window at the city lights and tried to figure out how Sarah had managed to make me feel like a failure at her own engagement party. "That was really something," David said finally. "It was. Jonathan is incredible, and Sarah, God, she's so well suited for that world. They make a great couple." I nodded, not trusting my voice. "What she said about you, in her toast was beautiful," he continued. "About love not being about perfection. She really does look up to you. Look up to me." Even David had internalized Sarah's narrative that I was somehow the wiser sister, the one who'd taught her about love and courage. The irony was suffocating. When we got home, I sat on my couch and thought about the timeline. 6 months ago, Sarah had met Jonathan. 6 months ago, around the time I'd started getting serious with David, she'd found herself a surgeon, a brilliant, accomplished, wealthy surgeon, who made David's achievements look modest by comparison. Was it coincidence? Had she genuinely fallen in love and just happened to land someone who outclassed my fiancé in every measurable way? Or had this been strategic, a way to prove her point about relationships and worthiness, and the kinds of matches that made sense? I thought about all the conversations we'd had about David, all her warnings and concerns and predictions about our future. Had she been speaking from experience with Jonathan, comparing my relationship to her own and finding it lacking? Or had she been setting up a contrast, positioning herself to be the sister who'd made the better choice? My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "Thank you so much for coming tonight. Jonathan was so happy to finally meet you properly. We should all have dinner soon." All have dinner, the four of us sitting around a table while Sarah and Jonathan discussed medical research and legal precedents, and I tried to keep up with conversations that were miles above my head. While David marveled at their success, and probably wondered how he'd gotten lucky enough to snag Jonathan's attention for professional networking.
I didn't respond to the text. Instead, I found myself thinking about something Jonathan had said, about Sarah telling him I was struggling with relationship doubts. If Sarah was spreading that narrative to her fiancé, who else was she telling? Was she building a case in the family consciousness that my engagement was fragile, uncertain, based more on hope than compatibility? The next morning, I called my cousin Rachel. "Hey, can I ask you something? At the engagement party, did anyone say anything to you about me and David?" "What kind of thing?" "Just anything. About our relationship, our compatibility, whether we seemed happy." Rachel was quiet for a moment. "Well, your Aunt Linda mentioned that Sarah had been worried about you, something about you having cold feet." "Cold feet? What exactly did she say?" "Just that Sarah had confided in her about you having some doubts about the wedding, that you'd been questioning whether you and David were right for each other." Rachel's voice became concerned. "Is everything okay? Are you having doubts?" "No," I said quickly. "No, David and I are fine. Great, actually." But after I hung up,
I sat there thinking about how efficiently Sarah had managed to plant seeds of doubt about my relationship throughout our family. Not direct criticism, nothing that could be called malicious, just gentle expressions of concern about my supposed uncertainties. I was starting to understand the full scope of what Sarah had been doing. She hadn't just been undermining me to my face, she'd been building a narrative behind the scenes. A story where I was the sister who'd lucked into a relationship above my station, who was struggling with insecurities and doubts, who needed guidance and support to navigate waters I wasn't equipped for. Meanwhile, she was the sister who'd found her perfect match, who'd landed not just any successful man, but a genuinely extraordinary one, who was confident and secure and naturally suited for the life she was entering. The contrast couldn't have been more stark, or more deliberate. That afternoon, I made a decision. I was going to Sarah's wedding. I was going to smile and congratulate her and play the part of the supportive younger sister. But I was also going to pay attention, really pay attention to everything she said and did. Because I was starting to suspect that Sarah's perfect romance might not be quite as perfect as it appeared. And if she'd been playing games with my relationship, if she'd been manipulating and undermining and setting me up to fail, then maybe it was time I learned to play games too. Maybe it was time I stopped being the sister who quietly accepted whatever narrative Sarah created, and started being the sister who fought back. The woman who'd spent months being told she wasn't enough, was about to discover just how much she was capable of. 2 weeks later, I would stand in Sarah's perfect wedding and introduce her to someone who would change everything. Someone who would make her face the truth about herself, about her choices, about the lies she'd built her life on. Someone she never saw coming. But first I had some research to do. The wedding was everything Sarah had promised it would be. Cascading white orchids from Ecuador, a string quartet flown in from Vienna, and enough champagne to float a yacht. The country club's ballroom had been transformed into something that belonged in architectural magazines, with crystal chandeliers casting rainbow patterns across marble floors. I stood in the receiving line wearing the pale pink bridesmaid dress Sarah had chosen, watching her accept congratulations like a queen receiving tribute. She looked radiant in her custom Vera Wang gown, every inch the perfect bride marrying her perfect groom. Jonathan's family had turned out in force. Distinguished doctors and their elegant wives, all carrying themselves with the quiet confidence that comes from generational wealth and social position. They seemed genuinely pleased with the match, welcoming Sarah into their circle with the warmth reserved for someone who clearly belonged. My research over the past month had been thorough. I'd started with social media, following digital breadcrumbs through Jonathan's professional network, his family connections, his social circles. What I'd discovered had taken weeks to verify, but when I finally had confirmation, I knew I had exactly what I needed. David squeezed my hand as we moved through the reception, making small talk with relatives and family friends. He looked handsome in his navy suit, though I noticed him checking his phone periodically. His shift at the hospital had been brutal the night before, and I could see the exhaustion around his eyes. "Dr. Martinez, congratulations," said a voice behind us, and we turned to see an older woman with silver hair and kind eyes approaching Sarah. "I'm Helen Blackwell, Jonathan's aunt." Sarah's smile was radiant as she accepted the woman's embrace. "Mrs. Blackwell, thank you so much for coming. Jonathan speaks of you constantly. Please, call me Helen, we're family now." The woman's voice carried a slight tremor that spoke of age, but her gaze was sharp as she studied Sarah. "I was hoping we might have a chance to chat privately. There's someone I'd like you to meet." "Of course," Sarah replied, though I caught the flicker of confusion in her eyes. Helen Blackwell gestured toward a corner of the ballroom, where a woman in her 50s sat quietly, elegant in a simple black dress. She had auburn hair streaked with silver, and the kind of classic beauty that suggested she'd been stunning in her youth. "Sarah, I'd like you to meet Victoria Brennan," Helen said as we approached. Victoria was married to Jonathan for 12 years. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah's face went through several expressions before settling into polite confusion, but I could see the calculations happening behind her eyes. "I'm sorry," Sarah said carefully. "I think there's been some mistake. Jonathan was never married before." Victoria's smile was sad but gentle. "No mistake, dear. We divorced 3 years ago." She glanced at Helen, who nodded encouragingly. "I wasn't sure if I should come today." But Helen convinced me it was the right thing to do. The color was draining from Sarah's face. That's impossible. Jonathan told me he'd never been married. He said he'd been waiting his whole life for the right person. I imagine he did say that, Victoria replied. Jonathan has always been gifted at rewriting history to suit his needs. Helen placed a gentle hand on Sarah's arm. Dear, I think we should sit down. There are some things you should know. David and I exchanged glances. This wasn't what I'd planned, but it was certainly interesting. The research I'd done had uncovered financial irregularities in Jonathan's practice, possible insurance fraud that I'd been prepared to reveal. But this was something else entirely. Sarah allowed herself to be led to a quiet seating area, though she kept looking around, as if hoping someone would appear to explain that this was all an elaborate misunderstanding. Victoria settled across from her, and Helen took the seat beside Sarah, like a concerned relative. Jonathan and I met when I was 28, Victoria began. I was a surgical nurse at Presbyterian, and he was the brilliant young doctor everyone talked about. The courtship was whirlwind, just like yours, I imagine. He swept me off my feet with grand gestures and expensive gifts and promises of the life we'd build together. Sarah's hands were folded tightly in her lap. If you were married for 12 years, why didn't anyone mention you? His family, his colleagues. Because Jonathan is very good at making people disappear when they're no longer convenient. Victoria said, when our marriage ended, he managed to erase me from most social circles. Professional consequences for questioning his methods, social isolation from mutual friends who had to choose sides. It's remarkable how thoroughly someone can be written out of a narrative. I thought about Sarah's own talent for rewriting history, and wondered if she was recognizing herself in the description. What happened? Sarah asked quietly. Victoria was quiet for a moment, choosing her words carefully. Jonathan is brilliant at his job, truly gifted. But he's also narcissistic, controlling, and incapable of genuine intimacy. The man you fell in love with, the charming, attentive, devoted partner, that's a performance. A very convincing one, but a performance nonetheless. That's not true, Sarah said, but her voice lacked conviction. Helen leaned forward. Sarah, has Jonathan ever mentioned his daughter? The question hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Sarah stared at the older woman, her mouth slightly open. His daughter, Helen repeated gently. Emily, she's 15 now. Lives with Victoria full-time, because Jonathan signed away his parental rights rather than pay child support. He doesn't have children, Sarah whispered. He told me he'd never wanted them before, but that meeting me changed everything. We've been talking about starting a family right away. Victoria's expression became infinitely sad. He told me the same thing when we were trying to conceive. That I was the first woman who'd made him want to be a father. When Emily was born, he was so proud, so involved. For about 6 months. Then she became an inconvenience, something that took attention away from his work, his image, his social climbing. I don't believe this, Sarah said, standing abruptly. Why would you come here? On my wedding day, if this were true, why wouldn't you have said something before? Because I didn't know about you, Victoria replied simply. Jonathan is very good at compartmentalizing his life. I only found out he was remarrying when Helen called me yesterday. Helen nodded. I've been worried about Jonathan for years. The way he treated Victoria, the lies, the financial irregularities in his practice. When I saw how quickly this engagement happened, I knew I had to act. Financial irregularities. My research had found those too, hidden in medical billing records and insurance claims that didn't quite add up. But hearing it confirmed by family members gave it new weight. What financial irregularities? Sarah asked, echoing my own thoughts. Billing for procedures that were never performed. Helen said. Inflating surgical costs, claiming complications that didn't exist to justify additional charges. The hospital board has been investigating for months. Sarah sank back into her chair. That's impossible. Jonathan is respected, admired. He speaks at conferences. He's also being quietly pushed out of Presbyterian. Victoria said, the investigation will probably go public within the next few months. I'm surprised he's moving forward with such a public wedding. Honestly. It seems reckless, even for him. Unless he needs the marriage for some reason, Helen mused. Financial support, perhaps. Or someone to stand by him when the scandal breaks. The pieces were clicking into place, and I could see Sarah's mind working through the implications. The whirlwind romance, the pressure to marry quickly, the expensive wedding that Jonathan had insisted on paying for, despite the coming financial storm. He loves me, Sarah said, but the words sounded hollow. Victoria reached out and took her hands. I thought he loved me too. For 12 years, I made excuses for his behavior, explained away the inconsistencies, believed his explanations for why things didn't add up. Love makes us blind to things we should see clearly. But we have so much in common, Sarah protested. We connect on everything. He understands me in ways no one else ever has. What does he understand? Victoria asked gently. Sarah struggled for an answer. He appreciates my intelligence, my ambition. He values my opinions about his work, my insights into human nature. Has he ever asked about your work? Your cases, your interests, outside of how they relate to him? The question seemed to hit Sarah like a physical blow. I watched her face as she processed it, realizing that their conversations had always centered around Jonathan's world, his interests, his needs. He's busy, she said weakly. His work is demanding. So is yours, Victoria pointed out, but somehow that never seemed to matter as much. Helen checked her watch. Sarah, the ceremony is supposed to start in 20 minutes. I know this is overwhelming, but you need to decide what you're going to do with this information. Sarah sat in stunned silence, her perfect wedding day crumbling around her. In the background we could hear the string quartet warming up, guests taking their seats, the final preparations for a ceremony that might not happen. Why are you telling me this? Sarah asked finally. Because someone should have told me, Victoria replied. And because despite everything Jonathan put me through, I don't wish that kind of pain on anyone else. David leaned over to me. Should we leave them alone? But I was fascinated by what was unfolding. Sarah, who had spent months manipulating my relationship, undermining my confidence, predicting my downfall, was discovering that her own perfect romance was built on lies. The irony was almost too perfect. There's something else, Helen said quietly. The prenuptial agreement Jonathan had you sign. Did you read it carefully? Sarah's face went pale. Of course I read it, all of it, including the clauses about asset division in case of divorce, and the section about spousal support limitations. Sarah started, then stopped. My lawyer reviewed it. Which lawyer? Victoria asked. Because Jonathan has a way of recommending lawyers, who work more in his interests than yours. The realization was dawning on Sarah's face, that she'd been outmaneuvered at every turn. The brilliant lawyer who prided herself on reading the fine print, had been led through a carefully orchestrated deception. I need to see Jonathan, Sarah said suddenly, standing up. I need to ask him about this directly. Of course, Helen agreed, but Sarah, think carefully about how you approach this. Jonathan is very good at explaining away inconvenient truths. He'll have answers for everything, explanations that almost make sense. Because he's had practice. Victoria added, years of practice. Sarah walked away from us, toward the groom's preparation area, her wedding dress trailing behind her like a white flag of surrender. David and I followed at a distance, along with Helen and Victoria, drawn by the same morbid curiosity that makes people slow down for car accidents. We could hear voices before we reached the room, Sarah's sharp and rising, Jonathan's calm and measured. The door was slightly ajar, and while I knew we shouldn't eavesdrop, I found myself straining to listen.
You never told me you were married before, Sarah was saying. It wasn't relevant, Jonathan replied smoothly. That marriage was a mistake, a youthful error in judgment. What we have is completely different. You have a daughter. A pause. Had. The relationship with her mother became toxic. It was better for everyone if I stepped away. Better for everyone, or better for you. Sarah, where is this coming from? Today is supposed to be the happiest day of our lives. Is it? Or is it just convenient timing for you? Someone to stand by you when your financial problems become public. Jonathan's voice changed, became sharper. I don't know what you think you've heard, but you're being manipulated by people who are jealous of our happiness. Am I? Because it seems like I'm the one who's been manipulated. You're upset, Jonathan said, his tone becoming condescending. Wedding day nerves.
This is exactly the kind of emotional thinking that gets you into trouble professionally. Even from outside the room, I could feel the shift in energy. Jonathan had made a crucial mistake, revealing the contempt that had probably been lurking beneath his charm all along. Emotional thinking. Sarah's voice was deadly quiet. You know what I mean. This is why you need someone stable in your life. Someone to help you see things rationally. The silence that followed was profound. Then we heard footsteps, and Sarah emerged from the room. Her face was composed, but her eyes were blazing with something I'd never seen before. Not anger, exactly, but a cold, clear understanding. She walked past us without acknowledgement, heading toward the main ballroom, where 300 guests were waiting for a ceremony that was about to become very interesting. Jonathan appeared in the doorway behind her, his face flushed but still confident. Sarah, we need to talk about this rationally. She turned back to him, and when she spoke, her voice carried across the corridor with perfect clarity. Rationally? Like when you rationally decided not to mention your first wife, or when you rationally chose to hide your daughter's existence, or when you rationally structured our prenup to leave me with nothing if this marriage fails. A small crowd was gathering now, family members and wedding party participants drawn by the commotion. Jonathan's composure was beginning to crack as he realized how public this confrontation was becoming. You're making a scene, he said tersely. This is neither the time nor the place, isn't it? Sarah smiled, and there was something terrifying in the expression. This seems like exactly the right time and place to discuss the lies you've built our relationship on. She turned toward the growing crowd of onlookers. Ladies and gentlemen, I have an announcement to make about today's ceremony. And with that, Sarah Martinez, who had spent months orchestrating my downfall, walked into her own wedding reception and systematically destroyed the perfect life she'd thought she was claiming. The woman who'd told me I'd never find a man worth keeping was about to discover that sometimes the man who seems too good to be true really is. And sometimes the sister you've underestimated is the one who ends up saving you from your own ambitions. Sarah stood at the entrance to the ballroom, her wedding dress pristine but her world in ruins. 300 guests sat in elegant chairs arranged for a ceremony that would never happen, their faces a mixture of confusion and anticipation. Thank you all for being here today, Sarah began, her voice carrying across the silent room with the authority she'd learned in courtrooms. I know you came expecting a wedding, and I apologize for the change in plans. Jonathan appeared beside her, his face a mask of barely controlled panic. Sarah, please, let's discuss this privately. She turned to him with a smile that could have cut glass. Privately? Like how we privately discussed your first marriage, or your daughter, or the fact that you're under investigation for insurance fraud. The gasps from the audience were audible. Mrs. Harrison, David's mother, looked like she was watching a particularly intense episode of a soap opera. My own mother had her hand pressed to her chest in shock. I want everyone to know, Sarah continued, that the man I was about to marry has spent the last 6 months lying to me about every significant aspect of his life. He's been married before, has a child he abandoned, and is facing criminal charges for financial fraud. Jonathan tried to take her arm, but she stepped away from him. Sarah, you're hysterical. This is wedding day stress making you irrational. Irrational. Sarah's laugh was sharp. You know what's irrational, Jonathan? Thinking you could fool a lawyer. Thinking I wouldn't eventually discover the truth about who you really are. Victoria had moved closer, and I could see the mixture of admiration and sadness on her face, as she watched Sarah do what she herself had probably never been able to do. And you know what the most pathetic part is? Sarah continued. I almost fell for it. I almost married you because I was so desperate to prove something to myself, to my family, to everyone who ever doubted me. Her eyes found mine in the crowd, and for the first time in months, I saw something like vulnerability there. I spent so much time trying to be perfect, trying to win at life, that I forgot to actually live it. I was so busy competing with everyone else that I nearly destroyed the relationships that actually mattered. The room was dead silent. Even the string quartet had stopped tuning their instruments. So no, there won't be a wedding today, Sarah announced. But there will be an excellent dinner, an open bar, and what I hope will be the beginning of some honest conversations with people I've hurt. Jonathan made one last attempt. Sarah, if you would just listen to reason, the only reasonable thing," Sarah cut him off, "is for you to leave. Now, before I decide to press charges for the fraud you tried to commit against me personally." He stared at her for a long moment, perhaps finally recognizing that he'd underestimated her. Then, with whatever dignity he could salvage, he walked out of the ballroom. Several of his family members followed, including some who shot apologetic looks at Sarah as they left. The silence that followed was profound. Then, slowly people began to move. Some guests quietly gathered their things and left, but surprisingly most stayed. They moved toward the bar, toward each other, toward Sarah, who was standing alone in her wedding dress, looking simultaneously devastated and liberated. I found myself walking toward her before I'd consciously decided to move. "Sarah," I said when I reached her. She turned to me, and I was shocked to see tears in her eyes. "Lisa, you don't have to say anything right now," I told her, "but maybe later we should talk. Really talk." She nodded, unable to speak. David appeared at my side. "That was incredibly brave," he said to Sarah. "I can't imagine how difficult that must have been." "Brave or stupid," Sarah managed. "I'm not sure there's a difference." "There is," I said. "Brave is choosing truth over comfort. Stupid is what you were about to do before you found out who he really was." Sarah's laugh was watery but genuine. "When did you become so wise?" "I learned from watching someone very smart make very human mistakes," I replied. The reception that followed was unlike any wedding reception I'd ever attended. Without the formal structure of a ceremony, it became something more like a family reunion, crossed with group therapy. People talked more openly, laughed more freely, and seemed genuinely relieved to drop the pretense of celebrating a union that had felt wrong to more people than had admitted it. Sarah changed out of her wedding dress into a simple black dress she'd brought for the after-party that would never happen. When she rejoined the group, she looked more like herself than she had in months. My mother approached us where we sat at what would have been the head table. "Sarah, honey, are you okay?" "I'm better than okay, Mom," Sarah said. "I'm free. But the money you spent, the plans you made, can all be undone or repurposed," Sarah said firmly. "Money can be earned back. Self-respect is harder to recover." Later that evening, after most of the guests had gone home, with leftover wedding cake and stories they'd tell for years, Sarah and I found ourselves alone on the country club's terrace. The lights of the city sparkled below us, and the night air was cool against our skin. "I owe you an apology," Sarah said without preamble. "Several apologies actually." I waited. "I've spent the last year systematically undermining your relationship, because I was jealous. Not of David specifically, but of your happiness, of how easy everything seemed for you." "Easy." I couldn't help but laugh. "Sarah, you made my life hell. You had me convinced I wasn't worthy of love." "I know," she said quietly, "and that's exactly what Jonathan did to me. Made me feel like I needed to earn his love, prove my worth, constantly audition for the role of his partner. The parallel wasn't lost on me." "Is that why you did it?" "To me." Sarah was quiet for a long time. "I think I was testing whether your relationship could survive what mine couldn't. And when it did, when David kept choosing you, despite every doubt I planted, I resented it. But you found Jonathan. You had what you thought was the perfect relationship." "Perfect on paper," Sarah corrected. "Perfect for my image, my ambitions, my need to win. But there was no real connection there. He never saw me, the real me. He saw a successful lawyer, who looked good on his arm, and could host dinner parties. I thought about David, about how he'd seen something worth loving in a bookstore employee, who burned mac and cheese, and lived in a studio apartment. How he'd chosen substance over surface. David sees you," Sarah continued. "Really sees you. And instead of celebrating that for you, I tried to destroy it, because I was afraid it highlighted everything my relationship was missing. Why didn't you just break up with Jonathan?" "Because admitting I'd chosen the wrong person meant admitting I'd been wrong about everything, about what mattered, about what kind of life I wanted, about what love actually looked like." Sarah's voice broke slightly. "I'd rather be miserable and right than happy and wrong." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching cars move through the streets below. "I'm sorry," Sarah said finally. "For everything. For the lies I told about our childhood. for undermining your confidence, for trying to sabotage your happiness. You deserved better from me. Yes, I did, I agreed. But I understand why you did it. Doesn't make it okay, but I understand. Will you forgive me? I considered the question seriously. The hurt Sarah had caused wasn't something that could be erased with an apology, but sitting here watching her genuine remorse, I realized I didn't want to carry that anger anymore. I'll forgive you, I said. But things have to be different between us going forward. No more games, no more manipulation. If you have a problem with something I'm doing, say it directly. Deal? Sarah said immediately. And Lisa, David's lucky to have you. You're going to have a beautiful wedding and a happy marriage, and I'm going to do everything I can to support that. What about you? What's next? Sarah smiled ruefully. I'm going to figure out who I am when I'm not trying to be perfect. Maybe take some time off work, travel somewhere I've never been, do something just because I want to, and not because it looks good on my resume. That sounds terrifying, I said. It does, she agreed, but not as terrifying as spending the rest of my life pretending to be someone I'm not. We talked until dawn, really talked, perhaps for the first time in our adult lives. We talked about our childhood, about the competition between us that had never been acknowledged, about our different definitions of success and happiness. We talked about our parents' expectations, and our own fears, and the ways we'd both tried to win at life instead of living it. When David picked me up the next morning, he found us both exhausted, but somehow lighter. Sarah hugged me goodbye. A real hug, not the performative embraces we'd exchanged for years. Thank you, she whispered. For what? For showing me what real love looks like, and for caring enough to help me see the truth, even when I'd been horrible to you. I hadn't told her about the research I'd done, about how I'd been prepared to expose Jonathan's fraud myself, if necessary. I didn't tell her that Victoria's appearance had been a coincidence that saved me from having to be the one to destroy her wedding. Some truths were better left unspoken. David and I were married, 3 weeks later, in his parents' backyard, just as we'd planned. It was simple and joyful, and perfectly us. Sarah was there, wearing a sundress instead of a designer gown, looking more relaxed than I'd seen her in years. She gave a toast that was heartfelt and honest, talking about learning to value love over status and relationships over achievements. She's doing better now. She took 6 months off work and traveled through Southeast Asia, sending me postcards from temples and markets and beaches. When she came back, she started her own practice, focusing on family law and helping people navigate difficult divorces. She's dating a high school teacher named Mark, who makes her laugh and doesn't care that she can't cook, and thinks her intelligence is sexy, rather than intimidating. As for Jonathan, the investigation became public 2 months after the non-wedding. He lost his medical license and is facing criminal charges. I occasionally see updates in the medical journals. David reads, and I always think about how close Sarah came to being collateral damage in his downfall. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if Victoria hadn't appeared that day. If I would have gone through with exposing Jonathan myself, if Sarah would have forgiven me for ruining her wedding, even if it saved her from a disastrous marriage. I like to think she would have, eventually, but I'm glad we never had to find out. The best part is that Sarah and I are actually friends now. Real friends, not just sisters who tolerate each other out of obligation. We talk regularly, support each other's choices, and when one of us is struggling, the other shows up, not to fix or judge, or compete, but just to be present. It turns out the sister who told me I'd never find a man worth keeping found something even better when she stopped looking for a man to complete her image, and started looking for someone to share her life with. And the sister she'd convinced wasn't worthy of love learned that sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is the truth, even when it hurts, especially when it hurts. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.